Hello, I'm Juliet Mann. Welcome to the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. Now think about this. In 1980, about 20% of China's population lived in a city. But by 2020, it was more than 60%. Rapid urbanization has been a key policy in China. Improved transport links and housing has given millions of people access to better healthcare, education, and of course, jobs. Poverty rates have fallen, the economy has boomed. But urbanization doesn't come without some drawbacks. The denser a population becomes, the more burden there is on the climate. I spoke to Chris Hamnett, Professor of Geography at King's College London, and Dr. Yang Song, Director of the Programme on Chinese Studies and a Professor at the University of North Carolina's Department of City and Regional Planning.
China's GDP per capita has increased, I think, more than tenfold since the 1980s, with much of its growth driven by urbanization. Cities such as in Shenzhen has become the major economic hubs, attracting investment, creating a lot of jobs, and becoming sort of a major economic hub in the world. And also, another benefit is to increase productivity for the country. As more people move to cities, as you can see, there are a lot of concentration of great skills and entrepreneurs, and this could lead to a development of new industries and technologies. For example, again, in the tech industry in China, it has flourished as an outcome of urbanization. The digital economy in China now is just amazing, worth over $5 trillion, I believe, and mostly concentrated in urban areas. And also, I think another benefit is improved living standards. Urbanization has brought access to many urban amenities, which people can enjoy more than before: healthcare, education, transportation, parks, arts, museums that you can think of.
And all of this has happened so fast. So, Professor, I mean, what do you think is unique about China's urbanization?
I think the urbanization process in China is absolutely astonishing. It's one of the fastest, if not the fastest, and it's absolutely the biggest process of urbanization in terms of the numbers of people, the size and the numbers of cities, which really has ever taken place, I think, in human history. Also, I would add, one of the key elements here, of course, has been the role of the Chinese government, of the state. So I think a lot of urbanization which has taken place in China has been, certainly in broad terms, state-led or state-directed.
So let's talk, though, about managing the speed of urbanization. Yang Song, what strategies have China put in place?
China has implemented quite a few strategies to manage the speed, as well as the impact of urbanization. The first one that we can discuss is the old school hukou system. So the hukou system is a household registration system, and it is designed to control migration from rural to urban areas. The government in recent years has relaxed some of the restrictions to allow more people to move to cities. Nevertheless, it has been useful in managing the speed of urbanization in China. But most recent years, the transition to governance, such as using comprehensive system of urban planning to guide the development of the cities by setting up specific targets in terms of the size of the cities, the density of the cities, the population density, right, and then also the sort of the land amount of the cities that they can grow. And another policy is the infrastructure investment the Chinese government has invested heavily in infrastructure, including highways, airports, high-speed rails to support and to manage the growth of cities, making much easier for people to move around and to help connect cities and regions. And of course, economic policies have been put in place to help the growth of smaller cities as well, not only just focusing on the major cities.
But while there's all of this building going on, I'm worried about environmental degradation. I think, Chris, urbanization is inevitably going to have an impact out there. So how do you think China's balancing that urban expansion while at the same time protecting the planet?
That's a very good question. I think it's certainly in the earlier decades, I would suggest that China really put most of the emphasis on economic growth and on urban growth. And I think of course, one of the consequences of that is that there has been a very marked outward expansion of the cities and the removal or the transformation of a very great deal of agricultural land, very fertile agricultural land, because of course a lot of the city growth has taken place on the as it were, the flatter, more level areas, certainly in the case of the Pearl River Delta or Shanghai or Chengdu. So the outward growth in the cities has had a big impact. I think another big problem has been that in some cases the outward expansion has not been concentrated enough, and that there's been a lot of, as it were, new peripheral settlements and cities outside the major cities with a very high degree of backwards and forwards commuting between them. So my fear here is that this has actually created very high levels of daily transport movement, which obviously generates a huge amount of pollution. That said, I think what has happened in the last couple of decades is the dramatic expansion of the subway system in many of the major Chinese cities. So Beijing, Shanghai each have about 15 subway lines, and many of the other cities are adding subway lines at a very, very rapid pace. So I think the government realize that they have to try to shift some of the people traveling from road to public transport. And that will be a very, very beneficial outcome if they manage that.
I know you're talking about the subway, but I can't help thinking about how the skylines of some of these cities have completely changed. Beijing and Shanghai come to mind, some of the world's biggest cities. How difficult is it, Yansong, to manage megacities like this?
Yeah, managing megacities is a significant challenge. The sheer number of people in the megacities, such as in Beijing and Shanghai, makes it really difficult to provide just the basic services such as affordable housing, healthcare, and to implement policies and regulations effectively. And Professor Hamnett just mentioned the traffic, right? The commuting or excessive commuting in the cities. As you can imagine, with large populations, traffic congestion is a significant problem in Chinese megacities. This not only affects quality of life, but also has some economic implications. And of course, Chinese megacities are also grappling with environmental degradation problems such as air pollution, car, the tail type emissions from cars, and many of the other environmental issues. But I want to emphasize the social inequality perspective of megacities. In the bigger cities, you would typically see that the wealthy people and the poor residents living side by side, and this makes extremely difficult to implement policies that would benefit all residents. So it's really requires much more effective governance, but it's really challenging just due to the complexity and fragmentation of the government structure in China, just as well in the world.
It's interesting, you're talking about the divide within the megacities, but Professor Hamnett, I wonder if you could talk about the divide there is between rural China and urban China.
It's a very major divide, although I think probably it has reduced in recent decades. I can remember very, very well some of my early visits to China, and outside of the cities, the rural areas, the degree of poverty was very high, the living standards were very, very poor, and urban workers at that stage were going back now to the late 1980s, early 90s. You would see them at the railway stations in the big holidays taking televisions or even refrigerators on their backs onto the trains to get to take them to the rural areas to put into the villages, etc. All of that, in a sense, has now completely changed, except for some of the perhaps much more remote rural areas in some of the more distant provinces. And I think what we've been seeing is a process of diffusion of urbanization. So it's not just the big cities, and China now has got more than 100 cities with more than 1 million people. And I think there's probably got 8-9 cities with 10 million people or more. But what we're seeing is in the wider urban areas, the smaller cities are growing, and beyond that, the small towns are also growing rapidly, and they've all been basically sucking in workers, residents from the rural areas. So I would probably say that the urbanization process in China is one that, broadly speaking, has lifted not all boats, but lifted most boats, even though some boats will not have been lifted very much. But it's had a huge impact and an improvement, I think, on living standards across China as prosperity has diffused outwards from the big cities.
So, Professor Hamnett, I wonder, do you think that China is going to continue on this path, continue to urbanize and to continue to do it so rapidly?
I think it's going to continue urbanizing, little doubt of that. And I think the Chinese government wants that and wants to encourage it because urbanization has been such a key part of economic growth, and particularly the role of residential development, the vast number of new apartment buildings which have been constructed in recent decades. This has all been a key element of economic growth, sucking in raw materials, iron, steel, etc. But I think in the fastest part of the urbanization process is now probably behind us. And I think inevitably, now that urbanization level is up to 60%, it's likely to begin to slow down simply because the size of the rural population, many of whom, of course, have moved to the cities, has begun to reduce and to reduce quite dramatically. So I think what we've seen is a very compressed, condensed process of urbanization, and I think probably it's going to slow in the next 10 or 20 years. That's a guess.
That certainly is a yes. Well, Chris Hamnett, Yang Song, absolute pleasure talking to both of you. Fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We've heard how China's urbanisation has progressed, but what about the rest of the world? Joining me now is Alain Bertaud, Senior Fellow at New York University's Maron Institute of Urban Management. Thanks ever so much, sir, for coming on the agenda. Now, I want to know why you think that cities who embrace rapid urbanisation will be the most successful.
Well, because cities, strangely enough, the larger cities, when labor markets are integrated, the more productive and innovative they are. All of us have always a feeling that cities are difficult to manage. They all have a problem of transport, congestion, pollution. But in spite of that, if you look at the results, people are more productive in large cities, in large conurbation, in large metropolis. And by the way, China has innovated there with cluster cities, which reach level of urbanization which has never been seen before. So people have been voting with their feet all over the world. Planners, by the way, didn't plan those cities. It's people moving to those cities which, in fact, oblige the planner to plan for them.
So what makes a strong urban space or town? What are the things that planners should be focusing on?
Well, really, it's a people who go to those cities who make a strong town. A very efficient sewer system or even transport system in itself doesn't make a city. It's, you go to a city because of the quality of the people who are there. So planners, in fact, have to make a city which is as hospitable as possible to newcomers. This means two things: linking transport and housing affordability. These are the two major things which, unfortunately, are very often studied separately, as they were two separate fields. In fact, housing and transport are, two faces of the same coin, and I think that to me maybe a bit of the problem in many cities. And the problem of affordability, housing affordability prevents some people from moving to cities where they will be the most efficient and the more productive. So I think this is a problem that we have to solve, and it affects in a certain way maybe more richer cities than poorer cities. That's it. And I think that it's mostly caused by bad planning, too many regulation in some area and not enough in other areas.
I wanted to talk to you about that because you mentioned the important things like mobility and affordability, but there are considerations like pollution, sustainability, and as you mentioned, regulation. I think you said 1,000 things that cities need to do to cope with urbanisation, all of those things that might in fact slow things down.
That's right. You see, there is no silver bullet. There is not one thing you can do which will make a city successful. There are, as you say, hundreds or maybe more than 100 things that they have to do at the same time. But they have absolutely to allow more housing and more diverse housing to be built. And most of the regulation we have prevent things from happening. Or oblige people to use more land or more floor space than they will want. If you have a minimum apartment size, for instance, it means that the regulation forces you to consume more floor space than you will want. If you have a maximum density, this is the same thing. In the 19th century, there were some reason to regulate densities in advance because technology were not, able to serve very high density. Now, our technology can serve any density possible. So let us people again vote with their feet, even within the city. And when there is a high demand for land and floor space, it's necessary then to develop the infrastructure will serve that. The infrastructure will be much cheaper than the land that is unused because of infrastructure has not been developed.
You talk about how technology changes things and has changed things, and also that the costs, as technology advances, sometimes it gets cheaper. But To what extent do you think that some cities are relying too much on outdated technology or outdated patterns of investment, traditional policies that are geared towards preventing change rather than encouraging it?
Most cities, I have conclusion, most cities have, their regulation are in fact to slow down change. And I think there is it's not that planners are stupid. It's because I think that people who already live in cities and have a successful life in a city do not want change. And I think politicians are in a way reacting to that. You see that in New York in particular, not taking into account now the crisis with the COVID, but say that all the regulations which are there to slow down as soon as you have the project of a new skyscraper with houses, with apartments, there are several lawsuits against it saying, well, it's not in the spirit of the neighborhood or something like that. So there is unfortunately a strong, what people call a NIMBY, a NIMBY movement in cities which are successful, strangely enough.
So NIMBY being, of course, not in my backyard. No. But let's look at the impact that China's rapid urbanization is having on the rest of the world. What impact do you think it's having?
Well, it's an example of developing infrastructure very fast and very efficiently. I started working in China, in urban China, in '83. My first visit was in '83. And so I've followed this development. I mean, it was astonishing how fast China developed its infrastructure. One example that I give in my book is Pudong, for instance. When I started working in Shanghai, Pudong was a swamp. There were some rice paddies, some warehouses, and the development of Pudong really required a lot of bridges, tunnels, and a fast-moving transit system, subway, which didn't exist. The government built all that in about 20 years, let's say. The subway of Shanghai now is much longer than the one in New York, and they did that in a fraction of the time that was necessary. So I think that in a way is an example where maybe I'm a little more critical of urbanization in China is when they expanded in the suburb, I think they had a tendency to give a contract, for development right to very large developers instead of trying to keep, let's say, to have a more diverse supply system. And I think that's a bit maybe the problem in the real estate in China now. Too many very large developers, not enough small or medium-sized developers.
So lots of people talk about China. They also talk about India. But what about Africa? And how is that going to drive the future of urbanization?
So Africa has a big advantage on every other continent because of its young population. But then Africa, the problem with Africa is, of course, very deficient infrastructure. If you see a city like Lagos, for instance, it is nearly as large as Shanghai, but it has a small fraction of the infrastructure, water supply, sewage, storm drainage, transport. And I think that the ability of the African cities to develop their infrastructure depends, on political situation, which is sometimes a little unstable. So I am not so sure if I hope that they will solve this problem. Another aspect in Africa also is the fragmentation of artificial borders. If you look at the part which is maybe developing the most urban, if you take a line between Lagos and Abidjan, you have a long stretch here of nearly continuous urbanization, but you have a number of frontiers there, and the frontiers are not necessarily very friendly. No, there is no hostility, but say there is a bureaucratic barrier to transport.
Which periods of development within a city do you consider to be good examples of urban development?
each city is different. So I don't think, there is a lot of cultural aspect to probably, one of the best, the city which has developed the most spectacularly and most efficiently have been Singapore. Singapore, they monitor very quickly what is happening. If they see a problem and they have identified some as they develop, they immediately modify their policies so to correct this problem. So that's but of course Singapore is relatively small. It's a city state, and it's relatively small. It's only 6.5 million people. So if you compare to Shanghai or the Pearl River Delta, the Greater Bay Area. Greater Bay Area now has about 90 million people. It's larger than Germany in a square of about 130 kilometers by 130 kilometers. This again, it's not a completely integrated labor market, but it's on its way of being integrated. Since I remember my first visit to Shenzhen in 1984, and it's absolutely astonishing the way they have managed to link not only Shenzhen but all the cities of the Delta together with infrastructure, and that makes, of course, their unique productivity and innovation.
Alain Bertaud, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Agenda podcast. Next week, as the annual Two Sessions gathering in Beijing closes, we'll consider what China's focus on high-quality growth, modernization and peaceful development means for the rest of the world. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also find more Agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.